Okay, I'm kind of saying this on a whim. It might be that once I talk myself through it, I'll be like, I'll think, oh, I should have, okay, I'm thinking of it wrong, or, whatever. So basically, I'm just like working through it, right? And so I'm thinking of the economy, right? Looking at or governing the government system, the social public service system, the human needs hierarchy, whether you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, things like that. And so kind of like the societal public service, and then economy and markets, banks, stores, that kind of thing. This whole network, this whole system network. And I'm also looking at it through, because I do like religion, theory, stuff like that. And I'm thinking, where do I see this in Scripture, in this basic story, and it talks about kingdoms and spirituality. Where does it kind of meet us in the realities of life pertaining to these types of questions, like systems, kingdoms, economy, social services, and stuff like that? And so for the most part, people that are probably familiar with these topics, they'll think of Scripture and they'll think, well, the temple, it kind of portrays the temple being a type of these certain societal services, to, maybe to some degree, maybe not exactly social services or societal services. It's a spiritual service, public service. Like spiritual arbitration between conflicts, going to the temple and having a sense of guidance through a judgment and justice and stuff like that, right? And then you see developing the story, eventually the temple becomes corrupt because some of the people that are the leaders become paid. They can be paid off by various ones. And so there's standards of judgment. And so it makes reference to this, like the scales, the standard of judgment is skewed and people are bought out. And so then it causes people to find other ways in the story to seek for a system. And then that ends up playing a big part. And eventually when they want a kingdom like the other kingdoms, because they don't feel like there's justice and there's corruption and things going on in the temple, right? Anyway, it becomes this whole long story of then this later corrupted system because it's fashioned after the world kingdoms. And then God warns them that if you set up a kingdom, you're eventually going to be susceptible to all of these other things because of trade, because of the connections that you'll have to make in terms of trade, where you'll have to also, because at that time what was involved in trade was also marrying into other kingdoms, and then drawing those kingdoms and their requirements through marriage as added on requirements into your kingdom. So eventually there were all these other requirements attached to trade. And so then it involved like idol worship. So then that gets into this stage of idols and whatnot. And so there really is. So I almost thought, oh, this would be interesting to write like an essay or something, but I just don't have time for essay right now. So I was just talking through it. Writing an essay, maybe titled something like the Scriptural Economy, or the Economy in Scripture, or the Bible Economics. But then I thought, I'm sure people have talked about this a lot, but it really goes back to, and I didn't look into it yet, so I'm just talking through. It really kind of goes back to how I was even saying before, it goes all the way to the ground level. And so I'm not an economist, but I do like word riddles and theory riddles, and I read Scripture, and it's supposed to be able to stand the test of time and speak into our daily lives and whatnot. And so I'm trying it on, right? And so when you think about Scripture, there's this portion where it takes the coin, just like a lot of old teachings and whatnot, it takes you from the level of the coin and the scales and the reference of money into the market, and how it develops in and among all of the levels of human complexity, whether it be through the temple and arbitration and that getting skewed, and then people being bought out, to other types of market and warfare and conflict, and the associations of trade with other societal behavioral requirements, and just all these things that morph, right? But it goes all the way back to the ground level and melting materials down into, so like at the time of the wandering tent, or the tent of meeting, prior to it being this like brick and mortar building or what have you. It was a wandering temple that was a place to accompany them as this public service along their journey. And then they would situate it and set it up. And it was this collective effort to set it up, this collective work. And then they had their different delegations. And then they would all be recipients of the benefit of the spiritual arbitration and guidance of the temple, right? And so there were times where they would literally have this free will offering, and they would, to build and develop or repair the temple would be through this free will offering of the needs of the temple, because the temple represented a collective public service. And so then they would give into that free offering and use those materials. And sometimes those materials were just literal things, tangible things to give that it needed to melt down and mold for like candle holders or other things, curtains, like weaving skills, material, stuff like that. And then they would repair the temple. And so at times the work was in relation to literally melting down materials and becoming a part of the thing that you were building. There was like this direct correlation or connection that you could see. And then you see later, as the work and the growth becomes more complex, then there becomes like money can replace some of those stages and then pay workers to do certain things. And so anyway, I was just thinking how also what becomes represented in the stage of arbitration in the temple is like the atonement money or the ransom money, where there was an equalizing portion of it. And this was a separate offering for counting the men of fighting age or what have you. And they would count the men, and they would give this half shekel, and one coin would be for 2 people, and no one could pay more or less. It was an equalizing factor, a balance of lives, not any kind of like excessive manufactured value, but the value of their life in this like atonement. And it seemed to have some association with balancing the warfare and conflict and things along those lines. Because later, as you follow the accounting on those scales, then you see eventually that's what also becomes associated as being way off balance and excessive. But also what correlated with that excessiveness of human behavioral animosities or tensions or world conflict also correlated with other excesses on the economic market or societal kind of snapshot of things. And so in a way you start to see that these become represented as more than like so many things: the spiritual state of people, the security gauging of it, the level of maintenance and sustainability, goods and services, all of these other things. You wouldn't really, for the most part though, you see mostly the emphasis is on the temple, not really like the market in terms of the greater market out there. The story in scripture is mostly the spiritual service, like shared public service of people. And like I said, it doesn't really seem like it's the world market. It's the state of people being spiritually aligned so that they're more situated to go out there and have proper scales in how they involve their life out in the world and whatnot. And I guess you could say some people would, portray this as the separation of church and state, right? You could look at that and have arguing point as to, well, this is the spiritual economy, not the physical economy. And so this is church, and then the world is separate. The world is like a different market. When you're looking at it like that, though, you'd say, well, then there's this difference between what becomes like the social public service, which is attached to a spiritual service, and then you have the market, which would seem different, right? Like the market would be maybe where people are out there physically trading for services in terms of like their needs for food and whatnot. And then it gets more complex when you're looking at societal public services. So anyway, you could argue that it seems like it's an argument for utilizing a collective, because the temple represented a collective, like utilizing the collective to have people pitch in to then offer services beyond just selling like milk and eggs and things like that. But social services like security, fire management, like the roads, or, other things where people can't just always, this gets into the whole economy thing of like public or private, or social services, public services, or private services. And, I guess that could kind of be pieced apart. But I guess just to keep it simple, though, really quick, what I'm thinking of, though, is I think over time, though, there became so many different competing. So let's just say, for instance, we're trying on the idea of separating it and saying, okay, then maybe it is kind of different. There's the world market, which is separate than this public service, which is separate and is kind of like a church and state thing. The church side being the spiritual, societal, public service, the do good for humanity kind of thing. And the other is like just your literal tangible market, like the state, I guess. But you could see how over time people would want to even separate that even more and secularize it, because there were warfare between what constitutes the public service or the spiritual services unto people, because people would guard what those looked like based on what spiritual denomination, because you hear this all the time. You say, well, a lot of those, the church can take care of those. Like the church will take care of these social services and stuff like that. And in some ways they do. There are some really good private organizations that do that. But then you also find that eventually they pick and choose based on their interpretation of God. And it isn't always necessarily expected to be the balancing of the scales, if you will, in relation to a person, because people would let their certain interpretations of that position kind of pick and choose who gets various services or how they're interpreted. And so then people would then think, well, we need social services, though, then that are separate from people's spiritual interpretations, or competing churches that would suggest to be offering those services for humanity or for the public, and just look at how we can secularize it in a beneficial way, in the sense of what are the tangible things without getting caught up in religious interpretations that are offered through these social or spiritual or like public services. And so then they would, make a list of those line items, possibly, like fire control, or like roads, or, those tangible public services. And then that gets involved in what we think of as like healthcare and social security later in life, labor, so that there's like, looking at universal human rights standards and needs, the hierarchy of needs in relation to what those public services are. So then that serves a sense of like the societal public services. And then there's like the world market. And it gets, like it crosses over, those things cross over. But I think on a simple note, if we are trying to look at scripture and think, what is there? Because then eventually, like, how do we address that? Because eventually Jesus then comes on the stage, and he does seem to have his own kind of economic approach to these things, the spiritual economy and the physical economy. And he seems to portray that they've both run rampant and had unequal scales or injustices. And that's a lot of what he's talking about. A lot of what's going on under the surface is that the economy is skewed at that time and being misused. Whether he talks about Caesar, and people trying to frame him for trying to overthrow Caesar, or whether he's being associated with like being infiltrated in the temple in relation to its deal that it has with Caesar or the world powers. And then he kind of calls that out when he suggests that they become sons of the kings. When he's talking about when they ask him about the temple tax, and there's a whole story behind that I've talked about before. And so then the question is, what what would he have done then? How does he look at the differences between those things? And I think at some level, though, maybe what some people are asking is like, even if there were line items for these things, people still just aren't, maybe it's like this notion that they're corrupting it, that there's not a standard of justice, or there's excesses in relation to it that are spilling over into all these other areas. And so anyway, I just wanted to introduce that basic idea that I was just pondering. And so, maybe later I'll have more to say about it. And so just kind of considering, what is the economics in Scripture? Like, does it really stand the test of time? Do we think about it, along those lines? And, we're still seeming to, as human civilization, trying to solve for that, like the spiritual economy, the physical economy, the balancing of it, the ways in which it becomes excessive, and what are the very basic functions to realign things. So anyway, just going to leave it at that for now.